sure I don't have to tell you that Israeli law is not Jewish law. Right? You know that Israel today, although it's a Jewish country, but Israeli law is not Jewish law, right? Israeli law, Israeli, British, Turkish law, a legacy of the mandate, democratically modified as time goes by, and therefore, although it is a Jewish country, is not governed by Jewish law. In fact, there's many consequences of this. Strictly speaking, one should not find oneself in an Israeli court, either as a litigant if possible, or as a lawyer, right? Because it's not right for a Jew to be tried by a legal system that is not Jewish law. But be that as it may, that's how Israeli law works. However, in some medical life and death areas, Israeli law is unusually positive or friendly to the halachic position. One of the reasons for this is that the Knesset decided some years ago that many of these areas are really not legal issues, they're moral, ethical, religious issues, and therefore it makes more sense to base the laws on that system. Right? Some of these laws were made by a committee of almost 50 people that the Knesset put together, including professors of medicine, some Arab members of parliament. Fascinating. Can you imagine 50 Israelis having to agree? I mean, it's like a nightmare. That is a miraculous thing. But this committee of almost 50 people agreed almost unanimously on most of these issues. And I'll try and explain what some of them were. And because of that, the law now mandates a number of things that are done in Israel, which are very good from a halachic point of view. In life and death medical matters, there are many areas of Israeli law, amazingly, that accord with halakha. Let me give you one example. 1996 in Israel, a law was passed called the Patients' Rights Act. This law allows you to force a patient into treatment against their wishes. That means the patient says, I refuse permission for surgery, you can hold them down and operate on them against their will. In very well circumscribed and defined circumstances. I'll explain what those are. But this is absolutely radical. First of all, this flies in the face of virtually all Western values. In any Western country today, in Britain, in South Africa, certainly in America today, if your patient refuses permission, you cannot do anything. Speaking as a doctor from personal experience, I can tell you, I've had patients who refuse to, for example, you get a patient who's a Jehovah's Witness, right? Christians who will not accept a blood transfusion. They're bleeding to death, and you say, you need an urgent transfusion, it's against my religion, don't touch me. You stand there and watch them bleed to death. Because as a doctor, you are not allowed to do anything to the patient that they refuse permission, right? I was in California some time ago at a medical conference, and there a doctor told me about a colleague of his who's an emergency room physician in California. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he got a terminally ill AIDS patient, right, who could not breathe, and who had said that he did not want to be saved and ventilated if he was ever in respiratory failure. But it was 2 in the morning, there was nothing in writing, so the doctor, out of doubt, intubated him and ventilated him. He's now being sued in California for wrongful life and assault. And if he loses the case, he will lose his license to practice medicine in California. In Judaism, that is ridiculous. When somebody says, don't save me, we put a sock in their mouth, we sit on their head, and we save their life. The only place where American law and British law has consistently agreed with our religious position is when it comes to a child. When a religious Christian says, do not transfuse my child, let them die against my religion, the law says you sideline the parents and you save the child's wishes. The American legal language is, the state has an interest in the survival of the child that overrides the parents' religious convictions. Very interesting. So therefore, in Britain today or in America today, if a parent says, do not save my child, let them bleed to death, you can sideline the parent and save the child's life. What's not clear is a fetus. A fetus. I was in Atlanta a few months ago. I gave a talk in the home of a man who's the head of anesthetics at a big hospital there. He told me that one night, 3 o'clock in the morning, he got in his operating room a pregnant woman bleeding badly. And it was very clear that if she didn't have a transfusion, the fetus would die. She would survive, but the baby would die. She said, don't touch me. Against my religion, I will not accept a blood transfusion. He said he phoned up a judge at 3 o'clock in the morning. He said, I want you to get out of bed and sign me a court order authorizing transfusion. No one's dying in my operating room. The judge signed an emergency court order. They held the lady down and transfused her to save the fetus. Okay, so that's a dubious case in modern Western law. But when it comes to a child, you can override the parents' wishes. But when it comes to the parent themselves, if they say, don't touch me, there's nothing you can do. And that is the situation. What does Israeli law say? Before we go into the Jewish attitude to this, modern Israeli law says that under certain circumstances you can force a person into treatment. What are the circumstances? They must be dying. The treatment must be life-saving. There must be no alternative treatment. That means if the patient has a reasonable alternative, you have to obey their wishes. But if there's no alternative, you can force them. And fourthly, and here comes a weird condition, you must assume and make a judgment that if you force them into treatment, they will later thank you. The law wants you to be a prophet, right? You have to assess that this patient is refusing, but they're making a misjudgment, and although they say no, and they're of sound and competent mind, if you force them, they will later agree that it was the right thing to do. What's the rationale? The rationale is we're concerned about somebody who's mentally competent, because if somebody's mentally incompetent, in every country in the world you can force them into treatment. When somebody's judged to be mentally incompetent, you get a psychiatric diagnosis to say that they're not in control, and then you force them. But if they're competent and in control of their faculties, but making a serious misjudgment, there's nothing you can do. So in Israel, they decided that we don't want to do that. When we feel that somebody's making such a serious misjudgment that under normal circumstances they themselves will realize that they were not balanced, you can force it. Example. Not long ago in Shaare Tzedek Hospital, they had a 23-year-old girl with cancer. This girl was expected to live for about 9 months, and then she was going to die and there was no treatment. She suddenly developed an acute bowel obstruction, and she was dying now because of this obstruction. She needed an emergency surgery to relieve the obstruction, and she would be fine. She would live for 6-9 months, and then she would die. Refused surgery. They said to her, look, if you don't have this operation now, tonight, you're going to die a gruesome death, terrible pain, and you're going to die in 2 days' time. Nothing doing, don't touch me, I refuse. They said to her, why? It's my right, I'm not signing consent. I happen to know some of the doctors involved. They held her down, anesthetized her, operated on her, and saved her life. The next morning when she recovered, she crawled down to the hospital florist and bought a big bunch of flowers for the doctors who saved her life. So they said to her, but why did you refuse? She said, I was too ashamed to tell you. I have a phobia of needles. I'm afraid of needles. I knew that you'll have to anesthetize me and give me an injection. I'd rather die. That is a wonderful application of this law. In the certain countries in the world, you would have been obliged to watch that girl die. Right? This is what the law is designed to cover, and therefore, in circumstances like this, you can, in fact, force someone into treatment. Sometimes you don't need to use this law. For example, about a few years ago in Tzfat, in Tiberia, in Israel, Tiberias, there was a 75-year-old lady with gangrene of her foot. So the doctor said to her, we need an emergency operation to amputate your foot. If not, you die. She refused treatment. They said to her, why? She said, I lived with this foot, I'm dying with it. They said to her, but look, you're going to die a gruesome death, the infection is going to spread, it'll be terrible. She said, I'm dying with this foot. They said to her, what's your thinking? Listen to what she said. She said, I'm 75 years old. If you cut off my foot and save my life, how long will I live in the world? A few years. And then I'm going to die and go to a world of eternity. I do not want to walk around up there without my foot. They said to a lady, that's not the right way to think. She said, don't tell me I lived with this foot, I'm dying with it. You know what they did? She was a Sephardi lady. They got the Israeli chief Sephardi rabbi to travel to Tiberia. He sat at her bedside and he said, lady, I'm telling you, I promise you, if you have your foot amputated in this world, you will wake up in the next world, you'll have your foot. She said, Rabbi, that's what you say, I'm signing consent. She signed consent, she had her foot amputated. That was the right way to handle that situation. So, that's the situation in Israel today. Under those circumstances, you can force somebody into treatment. Only where you assume they will later agree with you. What is the halachic attitude to this question? I actually wrote a book recently for doctors in which this discussion is given in full. It's a very good book. You need to buy at least 2 copies. If you buy 3 copies, you'll understand it very, very well. But the Jewish attitude is that we can force someone into life-saving treatment because you do not own your body in the first place. The reason that we say we can force you, because in Jewish hashkafa, Jewish attitude, we say your life and your body are a divine trusteeship. Hashem has given it to you to take care of. You're not free to throw it away. Right? Let me give you a couple of examples of this. One fascinating example is this. You know, there was a rabbi called Rabbi Zevin. Rabbi Zevin was a very creative, original thinker. He was one of the original editors of the Talmudic encyclopedia that is still a work in progress today. Rabbi Zevin, I think he died in the 1960s, very, very, very original and creative thinker. He has a fantastic halachic analysis of The Merchant of Venice. You know, Shakespeare's famous, very anti-Semitic play. You know, The Merchant of Venice? Shylock, the moneylender, lends money to Antonio, and the deal is that if Antonio cannot pay the loan back, Shylock will carve out a pound of his flesh as security for the loan. The collateral for the loan will be a pound of his flesh. And you know what happens in the play? He fails to pay the loan back, and Shylock demands his right to cut out a pound of flesh. I mean, incredibly anti-Semitic. Right? Shakespeare probably never met a Jew. He probably never met a Jew. But there was a Jewish community in Venice. The ghetto had been started in Venice not that long before. And he knew about the Jewish moneylenders. In fact, there were moneylenders in Venice. They weren't allowed to own property. And so that is the play. Rabbi Zevin has a fantastic halachic analysis of that contract. With the contract that a Jew makes to lend money, and the collateral for the loan is part of the body of the borrower, what would be the status of such a contract in halakha? And he shows that it's completely invalid. The reason is not because it will kill Antonio, but because he doesn't own his body in the first place. So you cannot pledge part of your body as collateral for a loan because it's not yours in Jewish thinking. Right? In the non-Jewish world, autonomy, my right, my body, I'll do what I want with it. In Jewish thinking, in Torah thinking, your body's not yours. You cannot commit suicide. Suicide is a crime against a life. And your body is not yours to dispose of as you wish, and therefore you have responsibility. I'll give you another example. The Radbaz, right? Rav David ben Zimri, very great Sephardi halachic authority, he lived in Egypt 600 years ago. He says the following thing, very, very beautiful. Do you know that in Jewish law you cannot incriminate yourself? Do you know that? In halakha, you cannot testify against yourself. Right? In America, they call this the Fifth Amendment. You cannot be required to say something that will disadvantage you. But in America, you can confess if you wish. If you go to court and you say, I committed a crime, and you confess it, you can. In Judaism, you cannot confess. Even if you try, it's inadmissible. Right? Not only that, we are so extreme about this law that we'll take half your testimony. Example, a person comes to a Jewish court and testifies that they committed a sexual crime with someone else. We believe the testimony about the someone else, but not about them. They say they committed a sexual problem with somebody else. About the someone else you can testify. With whom? Someone. Because it's inadmissible to testify about yourself. Right? Why? Says the Talmud. Because you cannot be objective about a relative. You cannot testify about your wife, son, father, brother, sister, because you are related to them. Says the Talmud, and you are your own closest relation. Who's more closely related to you than you? And if you can't testify about someone in your family because you will not be objective, you cannot testify about yourself. And therefore in Jewish law, you cannot incriminate yourself. Says the Radbaz, but that only applies to corporal and capital matters. Only where the punishment is going to be death or lashes are you invalid to testify. But if you want to say you committed theft, fraud, embezzlement, any financial crime, you are believed. Well, why? If you're not objective about yourself in capital matters where the body will be lashed or killed, why does the Torah trust you about financial matters? It might be financial ruin. It might be vast amounts of money. And if you trusted to be objective about financial matters, how come you cannot testify about? Very beautiful answer that I always teach when I'm talking to doctors. Beautiful. He says the reason is this. The reason you cannot testify about matters where the punishment will be death or lashes is because it's not your body. Who are you to testify to a crime where the result will be punishment and damage to your body? It's not yours. But your money is yours. And therefore, if you want to testify that you committed theft and the result will be you'll have to pay. Pay, baby, pay. It's your money. You ought not to waste your money, but it's in your jurisdiction. Is this clear? And therefore, in Jewish thinking, your money and your possessions are in your legal jurisdiction. If you wish to pay them away, you can, but your body and your life are not in your jurisdiction. And therefore, if you wish to have your body lashed or your life extinguished, you're not free to do so. It does not belong to you. Right? And that's the Jewish attitude.